Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Masked Singer, Season 5, Episode 1. To me, ultimately, I couldn't quite really find my footing within this first episode. I think really for this first episode, I was just like, I have no clue what's going on for any of these things. I was so disconnected from this episode. It was so weird to me for the most point. Um, Ultimately, it seems that most of these picks may seem or sound familiar if you actually had seen the episode. If you haven't seen the episode, you could go out of your way to finally say that you have by going into Hulu and being able to watch this episode. So, ultimately, I'm going into picks right away of who all had been the masked the seemingly masked marauders that ultimately got away with this week of going on. I will ultimately mention who is the masked marauder that ultimately had gotten unmasked, but I won't say their actual name and or names or nooms. Anyways, so the mascot who had gone home tonight, because ultimately there were only a certain number of them, was ultimately a new masked singer called the Snail, which ultimately I will let you know exactly who that person and or persons were, and so ultimately we'll leave that to the very tail end of this episode to show an unmasking. So ultimately I had went in to this episode just kind of baffled and or confused because like god, there's so many weird looking costumes this season and there's no way to really figure out who exactly anybody are. And so recently it's just kind of like for this first episode. So reasonably within the Russian dolls, uh, or Russian doll, I mean, who ultimately is the assessor of who I think that this is? Well, this Russian doll and ultimately seemingly another piece of sorts that ultimately is like, so this is a duo operational piece. There's two people singing along. It seems like there's a this big piece and then there's a smaller piece. It ultimately seems like there was a rendition of a Michael Jackson song, and so immediately like I probably went to like, you know what, this kind of maybe sounds like Boys to Men, like ultimately Robin Thicke had said. Also, you could go to any number of different routes. You can go in any of the maybe Jackson 5, or you could probably go into like the Hansons. Ultimately, I think the internet had thought that this might have been the Hanson brothers. So ultimately, I assessed at this point in time that ultimately it could be Boys to Men, but because I could be drastically wrong. This could be a male female duo because I couldn't really decipher the voices all that well. So, yeah, ultimately, that's what I kind of thought. Could ultimately just be this Russian doll, or Russian dolls, I mean, because there's two of them. And so, recently, kind of a very interesting approach within this, but there was like a lot of the clues really did escape me to figure out who this was. And I was like, I don't know who this is. And plus, there's some clues that really do not help you whatsoever. Like to me, I was ultimately looking at any number of these clues and I was like, I have no clue who any of these people are. Nothing got me closer, with the exclusion of maybe the one character. Like I think everything else was just kind of like, yeah. So moving on, the snail. Ultimately, there was a suggestion that ultimately the snail had quite possibly been Jay Leno, and I had kind of made that same assumption too. I'm like, you know what? Like the snail actually sounds like a person that would have like a certain like Ray Romano or Jay Leno kind of tone, or maybe even a Billy Crystal. that ultimately had people guessing who this was. And so immediately we end up having it to where maybe quite possibly Jay Leno could be the Snail and I could be correct, or ultimately I could be horribly, horribly wrong. So ultimately we'll find out by the tail end of this episode who ultimately had gone home tonight. The Seashell. So within the clue package, we ultimately have to where there was a seemingly kind of like a witch's broom kind of presented in here. And there was also like some other kind of clues that were saying that she had sang, but it's been for a very long time. And I was ultimately like, well, I had just seen the show American Gods, and ultimately Kristen Chenoweth had ultimately played Easter on that show. She had been the god of Easter on that show, and so immediately when like this clue package was to be represented, I'm like, well, I know stuff about Kirsten. I know that she had been in the play Wicked. I know like she is most notably for singing the song um, Popular in that portrayal. We ultimately have it to where recently Kirsten has been in a number of projects when looking at it. And so recently when they said Kirsten, immediately I'm like, yeah, I already kind of figured that out. But ultimately, Ken ultimately was on the same bandwagon. And so I was like, well, hey, I guess like-minded people think together. Um, but yeah, so that's all I really have to say for Kirsten. Really, I'm just kind of banging through these, kind of really banging them through, banging a bang, bang bang bang. So we end up having a raccoon that ultimately appears, and I am so baffled and confused about this raccoon. One, by how this character really kind of skated by otherwise just kind of like performing the way I would assume he did. Um, because it's like, okay, like I'm kind of thinking that maybe he's maybe not going to get very far. Because when looking at it, like I don't think that he could actually. I don't think he could actually hear what is to have gone on, like during his background. And so immediately I assessed or assumed this to me kind of sounded like Brian Johnson, who was ultimately the lead singer of AC/DC. Like I had heard that ultimately at some point that he had gone mostly deaf, so maybe that could be a hard problem for him performing. Um, Honestly don't know if he's still even alive. So if someone were to tell me like, well, yeah, he's dead, then I'm like, oh, okay, well, I guess scratch that thing on the list off the list. Sadly, I didn't look further of that into it. Um, but anyways, uh, I also thought of the stand-up comedian Jim Brewer because when looking at it, he basically does an entire stand-up thing where he ultimately sounds like AC/DC and he sings the song Hokey Pokey. Hokey Pokey! And then you turn yourself around! Like he does an entire bit about sounding like AC/DC. And so immediately, like, my thought was, like, well, hey, maybe it's Jim Brewer. Maybe it's ultimately Jim Brewer doing an AC/DC impression because maybe that's all he can do as far as singing goes is just sound like AC/DC. I don't know. I don't know that far along into Jim Brewer's singing skill and whatever, what have you, but immediately when I just was thinking of that, I was like, well, hey, how few people sound like the lead singer of AC/DC? And immediately, like, that's where I went into. Um, Reasonably, yeah, like, this character seemed kind of like an old soul, so it's just kind of like, I don't know. Like, it could be any number of things. Maybe I'm way off. Maybe it could be any number of different characters. If anybody has any number of guesses, feel free to drop them on down because I have no effing clue for this episode. So that's great. I have no clue for any of these characters for this episode. This is the hardest season ever, and I don't think we're gonna really clear the table out of this one uh, so far. Um, I might get luckier in other episodes, in other things, and other whatever, but this time around, I don't know about this season. So, like, we've been, I would say, 60 to 70%. Now we're probably going to be dipping a little bit further down the road sometime soon. So, let's move on. So, we have the Robo Pine, the robotic porcupine thing. And so immediately we have it to where the clue package was some kind of like spy, Charlie's Angels kind of thing going on into there. And I immediately was thinking like, well, maybe LL Cool J because he's been in like like an NCIS or whatever, or a CSI or whatever the heck that thing is, where he's in a show with Chris O'Donnell, and immediately I also thought, I'm like, well, kind of sounds like I'm like looking at it. How rarely do you ever actually see LL Cool J actually sing, and so on and so forth. But I also did look this character's age up because supposedly the RoboPine ultimately had mentioned that he is 60 years old, and I'm like, oh my god, like that really narrows down exactly who I could think that this is, and try and search and figure this out. So immediately I kind of still went with LL Cool J, even though he's 53 right now. Immediately, I just went with star Eddie Murphy, just because he's 59, and then on top of that, I just saw Coming to America, and so maybe he's going on to the show to promote Coming to America. I didn't know. I didn't know what to go with for any number of these characters. The fumbling and stumbling that I did in this episode compared to any of the others is ridiculous. And so probably none of these guesses are, well, maybe one out of eight are going to be wrong, even though I can't count. But yeah, maybe we can narrow this whole thing down. It was going to take me forever to find a 60-year-old that could sing, and ultimately they had made suggestions, but I ignored most of them. And excuse me. So yeah, so now we are going to get to a point here where we are going to reveal who ultimately the snail was and how reasonably I went into here. We're not going to really have a seasonal recapping right thereafter because ultimately there is not much of a season to recap yet. Plus, also, like, it was really hard to get any number of this kind of footage stuff because a lot of these things are kind of early, even for this show just being out, so on and so forth. So eventually, once we get down the rung, we'll probably get a lot of better quality things, I hope, at the end of the day. But anyways, so that's all I have for all the guesses. If ultimately you have every guess and you absolutely know who the person is, or you just want to give a random guess, go ahead. In my head, I'm thinking like I have no freaking clue, really right now, with the exclusion of me going like, yeah, I think Seashell definitely is definitely Kirsten. I think the raccoon could be just a person that really sounds like AC/DC and confuse the F out of people. Because immediately when I heard that, I'm like, you know what? Like, that's what it sounded like. But, anyways, so now we are going to get into the revealing of the snail. So, ultimately, if you fail to realize that ultimately that's going to happen, I apologize. But we are going into spoiler time now. Spoiler time. It's about that time to show who the snail was, or whom's the snail was, or has the snail was. So we're going to do that right now. The snail was none other than the Muppet Kermit the Frog. This is not an edit. This is not a geef. This is not a goof. Seriously, they had a hat to be unsheathed with this thing, and a Kermit the Frog popped out of it, and ultimately the resulting thing was Kermit the Frog. Kermit the Frog. Out of all the people in all our lives, we had to have a Muppet come out of a shell and be unmasked. I kind of like their ingenuity to approach this, but then again, I was a little baffled and or confused because I'm like, dude, I'm like, did anybody in the earth just confirm to say, well, obviously I know it's Kermit the Frog. Nail it down. unless it was people that ultimately are very familiar with that voice, and it's just like, oh, well, that's so and so person that ultimately is Kermit the Frog. How very few people in the world would probably have the ability to, like, well, it's Kermit the Frog, because we end up having to where Robin Thicke was mentioning, like, well, this guy sounds like Kermit the Frog, but it has to be a reasonable person. Robin Thicke, I guess, could now just say, well, anything could happen on the show now. Let's just throw out anything. The voice of Fozzie the Bear, come on out. And he rang and rung and whatever. I guess really with last season, how we actually had had last year where we had a person puppeteering somebody. Like this time around, it's like, well, hey, instead, let's actually have a puppet inside a mask. Which ultimately, I'm like, that is such kind of like a, like, I like it. I guess it's nice. Like, it's a thing for the family and stuff like that. Like, when looking at it, a lot of people, like, a lot of kids would probably just be like, oh my God, it's Kermit, yeah! Maybe for kids it'd be excited, but, like, I kind of also think that Kermit is kind of like a passing thing. It's been I get it also that when looking at it too, it's like, well, it's a family show, one. Two, it's a Fox show, so ultimately, why not just, hey, use every little bit of thing that they can do and have it be a Muppet, have it be Kermit, and ultimately, I can just be like okay with this. But when looking at it, it's just like, well, this kind of makes the show even much more difficult to think that. Like basically throw everything out the window. We ultimately have it to where there was like one clue about the snail where it was very much like he knew Dr. Drew and he was on a show, and I was like, okay, well, what? I was thinking talk show. Like, I wasn't thinking, like, if they, I don't know, it was severely hard. There was also a clue package that ultimately had it where there was some kind of clue of Hunchback and Notre Dame, and I was like, what the heck is that? I think that was otherwise tied to the raccoon, and I'm like, I have no clue what that means. What was it? The voice actor from Hunchback of Notre Dame? Was Notre Dame the place that ultimately this person had been? To do a movie? Is it Sean Austin or whatever from Rudy? Like, is anything possible now? Like, good God! Like, this show is just so confusing, and I'm at such a loss with this Kermit popping up, and Kermit the Frog popping up. But I really like the surprise though. When also looking at it, there could be just several times where I'm kind of feeling that stuff kind of feels kind of planned in this show, to where maybe the judging is maybe quite possibly rigged, because you never know. Because reasonably, there's sometimes where maybe they tend to decide to pick winners, because every reality show tends to do that at some point in time. But then again, like, because there hasn't been this really severe wild card that ultimately is like, yeah, I would have never expected this person in a million years to win this show kind of thing. Like, it's not like all of a sudden you would like get this like unsheathing of this person that's like, oh my god, like this is the person I never would have thought have won this show in a million years. Um, but yeah, it's just the fact that like now I guess anything could also be possible. I guess if you can just win people over, then ultimately, I guess it doesn't matter who you are, and like it would be really interesting if we get a person that gets voted in and won and whatever that we would have never have thought that would have gone that far. But I don't know. We'll see something interesting within the following weeks. I'm kind of really happy to come back to this, even though reasonably it also is a arduous process to try to do, to just figure who is who during the show, because there's just kind of like a rush to just go like, oh, okay, I have to figure out who this person is before they get on mass between the episodes, and all the clue packages are just like, oh my god, this is so confusing, especially in this season. Like, if anything, we had like last season. I felt like most of the clues were just kind of throwaways. But then I thought in like this season, I'm like, oh, so are they making them easier? Like, and ultimately, I thought that Kristen was the only one that I thought was easier, but everything else was like, no, no. And so ultimately, we'll figure out what those clues mean, and we'll figure out what is to go on with this show. But ultimately, I am going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.